Hi guys, welcome back. Okay, we've finished messing around in Photoshop for the time being. It's time to get dirty with some markup and some styling. So if you followed the last video, you should have something along the lines of a pile of source files that look like this, or more or less in any case. This is the images folder that I've created, and in here are just a few of the little graphics that we've pulled out of the PSD. So now it's time to start getting our index.html, which currently looks like this. We want to make it look a little bit more recognizable in the form of our magazine layout like this. So the first thing we're going to have to do is alter some of the markup. You'll notice if I just bring up the inspector here that what we're essentially dealing with skeleton is a large single container that goes the length of the page, and we of course have to deal with a series of horizontal bands in our layout. So what we're going to effectively have to do is create a series of those containers, each one of which is going to be wrapped in these horizontal bands, which we're going to then color using the graphics we've snipped out of our main design. So we're going to split things up right now. Here is the index.html. This is what you get along with skeleton as a basis to work from. The header should look fairly familiar to you as an HTML5 boilerplate header. Here we've got our title, so let's just switch that out straight away. And all the other little tags in here, such as description and author, that's all fairly familiar. The viewport meta tag we covered on Web Design Tuts recently, if you remember. I'll put the link underneath the video just to remind you. And then we have the links to all the CSS files, the HTML5 shiv just to bring older Internet Explorers up to date, and here we have all those icons that we snipped away at in the previous video. So let's just ditch this tag, this comment at the top of our document here, and we're going to remove the title. I'm going to put something else in there actually, just so we've got something to work with. This can be our logo. I'm going to give that a class of logo as well. Okay, we'll call that magazine. And now we have here a series of other columns within our container. So what I'm firstly going to do is wrap the whole thing in a band. Now you can use whatever HTML5 element you think is necessary here. You could use a section, for example. I'm just going to use a div just for the sake of argument, and I'm going to give it a class of band, and this is what we're going to wrap around all our container elements. So the first container element is actually only going to house our header. So let's just end that container there. Like so. And then we'll end the band as well. I have that on my clipboard. Okay. So that's the first band. And then we're going to need another band. Simple as that. I'm going to use that to wrap those columns, and of course I'm going to need to open that container band as well, container element, sorry, like so. So you can see what I basically have here is my selection of horizontal bands, each one of which contains this container, and now this is part of the skeleton markup. Each of these containers will have within it all the various columns that we're going to use from the grid system, and we'll go over the grid system in a minute. So for the time being, we've got our header band. I could do with another band for the navigation, so I'm just going to copy and paste that to make another band. I'll give that an additional class just to identify it further. I'm going to do the same on the one which holds our header. I can be more specific with the markup within these in a minute. So now let's see, what do we have in our PSD? We have our header, Then we have our navigation band. We're going to have this slider band. So we'll just whack another one of those in there. Although thinking about it, that doesn't need to be a separate band of its own because this whole area here is one single background. So that's what we'll do. We'll contain all of this within that. So that's fine. So once we've got that main area, we then need to move on to our footer. So which one were we on? This was our navigation, and then here we had the that was our main content, and then we had the footer. We'll call this one footer down there. That's where we're going to contain all our footer elements. And then lastly, there was a final one at the bottom, which we will call bottom. Okay, I'm going to save that, and if I open Chrome again, you'll see, you'll notice for a start I've got live reload on. That's worth checking out if you're tired of hitting the reset button every time you've made a change. So we have here our header, then we have the navigation, then we have the main content, then we have our footer, and then we have our bottom. So it still looks a bit of a mess. We could do with cleaning up the contents within those. So to start with, what I'm going to do is style the colors so we get some visual clue as to exactly what we're looking at here. So if we open up our style sheet, there are 3 to choose from, but we're going to ignore base and ignore skeleton because they're fundamental style sheets for the skeleton framework. We're going to open a layout, which is basically a blank style sheet waiting for you to fill in your own additional styles. So that's what we're going to use. We're going to begin by entering some styles within the comments here under site styles. So one thing to note, what we're first going to do is we're going to use something which you might be familiar with if you've been paying attention to Paul Irish, or Jeffrey Ways mentioned it on NetTuts, and actually we covered it on Web Design Tuts recently with form elements. Is we're going to apply box sizing border box to every element in our design. What this does is affect the way that elements handle padding and border styling, instead of what we're used to these days with adding it onto the outside of any given element. It adds it to the inside. So if you have a div that is 20 pixels square and you add some 5 pixels of padding and a border, the whole element will still remain 20 pixels in dimensions, because those padding and borders will be added to the inside of those dimensions. It's an extremely, it's actually a bit sort of old school. This is how Internet Explorer 6 used to do it, and only recently designers have decided to adopt this as a better way to the way that we handle the box sizing these days. So we're going to stick that in first. It doesn't affect any of the styling of the framework yet. You'll see there's no padding or borders to take into account, so we're fine with that, but it's going to make designing an awful lot more intuitive later on. So that said, we'll move on from there. We're going to start colouring these bands now. We'll get that over and done with. So let's put a little comment in here. And okay, so the first thing we're going to deal with is our default band styling. We called it class of band, and I'm going to add a background of that URL, and we're going to apply the background main PNG, which we sliced up earlier. I'm going to apply a default background value for that as well. Now if we just switch over, you'll see that each of these bands, because they all have a class of band if you remember, now has this noisy grey background applied to it. So let's get a little bit more detailed. We're now going to move on and apply some style to some of our other bands. Our navigation will have had another image applied to it. That was our darker version. I'll repeat that as well. And we'll give that a default value of that. Moving over to Chrome. Alright, things are starting to clarify a little bit. There we have our darker, noisy background. This was our main area, so that's going to stay the same, and then we had our footer and the bottom area at the bottom. So let's just do those quickly. That was band, footer, background URL, relative path to our background footer. No, actually, my apologies, there was no background footer, it was just the dark one as well, wasn't it? There we go. Repeat, and of course that's got the same default footer colour. There it is. Lastly, we've got the bottom, which was a slightly different colour, a bit darker. URL. Oh, excuse me. Background URL and a relative path to our background bottom is what I called it. Of course, the file names that you've prepared might well differ slightly from them. And what did I have as my... That was also a 3.4. Good as anything. There we go. Okay, subtle difference there, but that's quite effective. So we can now at least see more or less what we're talking about, and that's cleared up our layout quite a bit. But if we switch back to Photoshop, you'll notice that actually it's not quite that simple, because if we zoom in, the top of our very bottom area, that has a stitch on the top as well as this background, and the footer also has an additional background. And actually the navigation, I zoom up to the top there, that also has an additional stitching at the top. So those are all styles that we're going to have to take into account. Of course, we don't want to mess up our markup any more than necessary. So one way to achieve this is to keep things exactly as they are, but just to apply multiple backgrounds to our existing elements. That's quite simple to do that. All we have to do is apply an additional background URL to each of our bands. It's comma delimited, and you can do as many as you like. If the browsers support it, and I'll list the supporting browsers underneath, then it'll be fine. So our navigation, that had an additional stitch thing on the top. We have to make sure that we apply appropriate layering to this, and I want my stitch to be the first thing on top of the background image stack. So I'm first going to add that, and I called it, what did I call it? It was the stitch HRPNG, and I want that to repeat horizontally, and that's it. So I'll put a comma in there, I want a comma in there, and then I've got my final colour, which will be the base underneath all of those. So that represents the image stack exactly as it appears. We've got the stitch on the top, rename that, and then we've got the basic image, the noise image on the bottom, and then underneath that is the default, the backup colour. So we'll save that, open up Chrome, and if you concentrate very hard on the screen, if you're watching in high definition at least, you'll be able to see that there's a very subtle stitch on the top of that, as well as the other textures. It should be a little clearer on the other examples that we use. So let's go back to the footer and add another one to that. There we go. So we'll put the stitching one on that as well. That was a slightly different stitch, and it was called stitch large. Again, your file names might differ from mine. That's quite likely. That's going to repeat horizontally along the x-axis, and then of course we've got our other two values like so. Save that, and there you can see it's applied perfectly the two images, just as the design in Photoshop. What I am going to have to do is add some padding to that, because now the text is going over that. So to account for that, I'm going to add some padding, 49 pixels on the top. I'm going to talk about vertical spacing in a later video, but for the time being just do as I do and all will be well. So we'll go for padding 49 at the top and 0 pixels. I also want to change the color because we want pale text on our dark background, so that's what we're going for. And you can see there we've got our padding at the top there to give us some room at the top. We've got our paler text and our two backgrounds. Last but not least, we had one on the bottom, so that was this band here at the bottom, and I want to again add another URL, images, and this one was called Stitch Staggered. Again, this is repeating along the x-axis. Put a comma in there, comma there, and finish up with our default color at the bottom. Again, I'm going to want to add some padding to that, like so. 28 pixels. It's not quite such a large secondary image, so I don't need to allow for quite so much space, and that's more or less how it should be looking. And again, of course, being a dark background, we could do with a lighter colored text just to show up on that. Okay, that's looking good. Notably, of course, we've got all this nonsense content in here, and of course these columns don't apply to the design in any respect. So now it's time to quickly take a look at the getskeleton.com grid that is used. Here it is. It's based on a 16 column grid, and it's very simple syntax. Just like many other grid systems, you apply a series of classes to divs and they split up along columns. This column here, for example, will have a class of 11, this one a class of 10, etc. So we'll see how that works now in relation to our design. And the answer to that poser is that it actually doesn't apply very well at all, because our design is based on 12 grid columns, and our framework is based on 16, so we can't apply pixel perfect layouts just like this. We're going to have to sort of interpret that a little bit and be a bit flexible, which is fine. So instead, for example, of an 8 column width for this section and 4 here, we're going to have to use our noggins a little bit, and we'll actually go for 10 and 5. It's more or less proportional, so that's fine. So now let's have a look at how we actually apply that. We'll get rid of this, we don't need that for the time being, and we'll go back into Coda. So we have on our index.html, we wanted on our let's see, what did we have? We had our main area, and this was this one underneath the navigation, so obviously we don't need a logo in there. What we do need is we have our 16 columns. That's a full width. Every div needs to have a class of columns, and then it needs to have its appropriate width, however many columns wide it is. This in this case is 16 columns, taking it the full width of our container. But what we're going to do, I'm just going to throw some content in there so we've got something to see, is we want our first one to be, actually this is where our slider was going to be, so I'm just going to add some text to illustrate that. That's going to be slider, and then under that we want our 10, and then we have 5, and I'm just going to make sure that's clear, so I'm going to put end 10, what am I doing, excuse me, it's gone totally wrong, like that, and then here I'm going to put end 5. Of course, though it isn't 5, we're based on 16, so actually that should be 6, shouldn't it? Apologies there. So there we can see that's 10 and the 6 are adding up to the total of 16. content in there, some content in there, and we'll save that and see how that's looking. So here we can see our slider, that's filling up our 16 columns, and then we have our 10 column area and our 6 column area here. And of course that's all responsive because it ties in nicely with the media queries that the skeleton provides us with. Alright, we've got our navigation in there, so we may as well make that a little clearer as well. We don't need that. I'm just going to leave that in there like that. So we had our 2 columns, and then we added our footer. We have 4 equally sized columns, that's fairly clear, and then underneath that we have 2 columns in our bottom area, so to speak. So what we're going to do now is split these columns into 4. Each one is 4. Like so. And then we just need 4 of those. 4 times 4 being 16. Got you learn all sorts here, don't you? There we go. And then we have the band at the bottom where we have 2 columns. So they will of course need to be 8. So we have there are 2 8 columns within our bottom band. Save that, open it up in Chrome once more, and something has gone slightly awry. Oh, that's right, because we're using column. That's another system which we're not concerned with. These need a class of columns, not column. Okay, save that. Go back over. Alright, so now you can see that we have in our main area our large column and our sort of narrower sidebar. We have 4 columns within our footer, and we have our 2 columns within our very bottom area. So that's starting to look an awful lot more like the layout that we're aiming for. Excellent. So in the next video what we're going to look at is probably the navigation. I think the navigation is a good one to handle next. So catch up with me on all those pointers, and I'll see you in the next video.